Welcome back, everybody. So despite political freedom following a history of injustice and apartheid policies, South Africa is still haunted by its past. Transitioning into democracy and attempts at redressing the past have not been an easy feat. The country is still grappling with glaring racial tensions, disparity in the schooling system, and economic injustice still a human experience for many. On this Reconciliation Day, we reflect on the strides made and, of course, that long road ahead that we still have to travel. Jasmin Sooka, who's a lawyer and former commissioner at the TRC and former executive director for the Foundation of Human Rights, joins us to talk about this. Thank you so much for being with us. And happy Reconciliation Day, can I say that?
I think you can. And good morning, Leanne, and good morning to your listeners. I do think we have to be kinder to ourselves and to recognize that perhaps 26 years is a small slice of history. And despite all of the challenges that we have now, we have to acknowledge that we did stare down our past, and it was really very, very ugly. But perhaps along the way, we didn't pay attention to some of the core issues that remain a legacy of that divided past. And that is to go beyond political elite reconciliation and to deal with many of the structural problems that divide us: spatial apartheid, the socioeconomic dimensions of apartheid, the fact that South Africa still has the greatest levels of poverty and inequality in the world. And when we look at the last week where the ruling party was not able to deal with the land question, you can see that on those structural issues, we remain divided. And that is because we haven't really had redress. We haven't had an acknowledgement completely that the recommendations that the Truth Commission made 25 years ago should have been implemented. And so we are living, I think, with a legacy of all of that today. And there is some disappointment that, in fact, South Africa works for a few, but for the vast majority, it's completely unjust and unfair. I
mean, you touched on the land issue. I mean, that's just one, as you say, of a host of issues that confront South Africans, the majority of South Africans, on a daily basis, where yes, we did have a TRC. Yes, there is a day like Reconciliation Day where we're meant to put our differences aside and come together as a rainbow nation and, have this wonderful, significant day where everybody just comes together and almost sings Kumbaya, which in reality is not happening. And in fact, one would almost look at the situation and say, through the years, it has gotten worse. Can we say that? I mean, do you think that South Africa, there needs to be an intervention of some sort to try and rectify a situation that seems to be getting worse?
Well, I think the events in July this year showed what a polarized society we are and how spatial apartheid, which is deeply racialized, still impacts on South Africa. And I agree with you, we need a massive intervention. And it has to be led by the state, but should involve all South Africans. You know, the greatest threat facing our country are the levels of poverty and inequality. And that in itself constitutes a new form of violence. And so I would argue that the political violence of the past has shifted into other forms in our country. The violence of poverty that people have to live under, the violence against women in our country, and the violence against children. And, we cannot live in a kumbaya world. I think we've lost the notion of what it means to be a rainbow nation, if ever we were that. And I think that reconciliation is hard, it's difficult, and it needs a complete effort. And, COVID pandemic has really laid the fault lines in our country bare. The fact that the opportunities are lost to young people in our country, access to healthcare, access to education, are all determined really by your access to the economy. And in that kind of context, how can we enjoy political freedom? It has come with a huge cost. And so maybe this Reconciliation Day, we need the authorities to really commit to dealing with the structural issues which divide us in our country.
Yeah, and you know, if somebody is living in the means that you have described, whether it be in violence, inadequate education, no housing, sanitation that is way below any level of acceptable healthcare that treats its citizens in such a bad manner. I mean, this is, you know, the dignity of South Africans is taken away. And then, of course, you do have this divide where you do look at a white South African as opposed to a black South African, and you see the different lives that are being led. 26 or 27 years later, this is still the case. Now, when we go back to the days of the TRC, for instance, I mean, the TRC keeps getting questioned and resolutions still keep being asked. Why has this not been implemented? Why are we not seeing reparations? Why? There are more questions as to why the government of the day, and I talked to the ANC, has not acted on many of the issues that came out. What is your views? I mean, you were actively involved in this.
You know, increasingly in South Africa, particularly around, you know, with young people, many of them say that the TRC was a sellout institution and actually we lost our rights. But I think that what that doesn't do is understand the complexity of the transition and the compromises that had to be made. And so within that framework, I think we constructed the best option possible. But of course, for that to be one which would be meaningful for South Africans, it required that the state, in the aftermath of the Truth Commission, actually commit to the recommendations. So when you look at the three categories, you know, the question of accountability on prosecutions, I think I sound like a stuck record when I say that 23 years down the line, we know that the ANC and the ruling party actually deliberately suppressed the investigation and prosecution of TRC cases where there had been no amnesty or where people had failed to receive amnesty. The second issue is around reparations. You know, there's an awful amount of money in the President's Fund, which is intended to deal with reparations. And today, that money really hasn't been disbursed. And when you look at the questions of institutional reform, the recommendations we made around the security forces, around the police, around governance institutions, none of them have been implemented. And so when you look at the spectacular failure of our society at many levels, which was demonstrated in July this year, you realize how important it is for those recommendations to have been made. And of course, this year, you know, no more eloquently was it said when the chairperson of the Portfolio Committee said to the NPA and the Minister of Justice, he reminded them of the preamble to the Constitution, which talks about the historical injustices and also being able to honor those who gave up their lives for freedom. And in that respect, spectacular failure. I have suggested that, in fact, the first thing our president needs to do is actually to apologize to the victims of apartheid-era crimes in our country, to acknowledge the fact that in the last 23 years, the state has prejudiced the rights of victims to accountability and justice, because as each day goes, the reality of a prosecution for them becomes more remote. The callous way in which this has been dealt with by the state and the NPA and the Hawks is something that we all need to ask. Should they be charged for that?
Yeah.
And that is why we've also asked for a formal commission of inquiry to unpack who was behind the suppression and what the motivation for that was. Because then the edifice of the work of the commission is really to be questioned, because some people came forward, victims unburdened their hearts. They spoke about their pain and their suffering. But to what end? This is not a spectacle. It is about a real engagement to understand the truth and systemically to deal with those structural questions
Yeah,
which
yeah.
allowed the violence to happen in our country.
I want to spend a little bit of time talking about the death as well of a former, the last apartheid president, F.W. de Klerk. I mean, we saw the state memorial service being given for him over the weekend. Lots of things said there, lots of anger in South Africans when we heard about the news of the passing of F.W. de Klerk. And then to watch an apology video of a very frail, ailing man coming through and apologizing, whereas throughout his life he barely apologized for it. Shared a Nobel Peace Prize with former President Nelson Mandela, shared in the glory, and yet many people would say he's gone to the grave with a lot of the answers that so many are seeking for. I mean, we could just look back at a tweet that Julius Malema put out, with regard to saying, do not give this man a state funeral, which of course he wasn't granted, but then of course the memorial came through. But he said in this tweet, a state funeral for de Klerk would be an insult to the families of the Cradock Four. It would undermine the memory of the people of Boipatong, Mthatha, Bishu, the people of Vosloorus, and many communities who were maimed by his state-sponsored black-on-black violence. That was a statement that was released by the EFF. Now, the reality is that nobody's really being held accountable for the amount of lives that were lost and the atrocities that were committed. And this is a huge problem. How do you close a wound?
You can't close that wound. And it's a gaping hole for many of the families that we are supporting. FW was reputed to have sat at more than 96% of the State Security Council meetings. And the State Security Council was the parallel institutions which was responsible for the establishment of the death squads, for financing and authorizing operations, and really for putting up a list which was approved of people who had to be taken out. And so when you consider the plight of the Cradock Four families, they know that there were two critical meetings of the State Security Council at which the late Mr. de Klerk was present. In the first one, they talked about having to deal with these troublesome teachers. And in the second one, that is when they gave the authorization for them to be permanently removed, which in effect was the assassination order. Now, when you think about the fact that Mr. de Klerk went to his death without ever disclosing those details, and that furthermore, when he came before the commission, he refused to accept any responsibility for the death squads and for the criminal operations that they had been implicated in. And so when you listen to his apology, his deathbed apology, I was struck by the fact that while he apologized to victims and he apologized for apartheid, there are three sentences he never said. He never said that apartheid was declared a crime against humanity. Mm-hmm. He never acknowledged that apartheid was a criminal state. And he continued, I think, with the rhetoric of the bad apple theory. And in my view, that constitutes a complete denial about what the apartheid state was responsible for. Yeah. And that denial is another form of injustice, another violation against the victims of South Africa and ourselves, because we are unable to put to bed the past, because it haunts us. And for individual families who have been waiting for the NPA to deal with their cases, it is just another shocking violence and violation. And remember, all of the cases that you see, whether it's the case of Ahmed Timor, the Neil Agate case, the Haffiji case, the Cradock Four case, the Simelane case, these didn't come because the NPA was doing its work. It's because together with the families, we litigated against the NPA and the state, and we actually forced them to act in these matters. And so when you look at the 2nd of December, when they missed a crucial deadline to inform the Cradock Four families of what their decision was going to be, and they just treated it in a very normalized manner, because that is what it has happened. The prosecutions are normalized for them. They don't see any problem with letting families down.
And this is the reality, and we see it all the time. And Jasmin, I don't want to do this, but we've literally got a minute left, and it is such an important conversation, and you really have spoken such truth. But I really fear for our future. And these are such unresolved issues that, you know, if you leave something to fester for long enough, as we have done for years and years and years, and yes, we can celebrate our triumphs. We can. I'm not going to ignore the triumphs, but it appears that the anger is growing more and more and more, and this is very, very dangerous for our future. May I ask you to wrap it up? I mean, it's impossible in 30 seconds, but just give us a closing line. What do we need? What does South Africa need to put this in a way that we can actually heal, but in the right way?
Well, I think the first thing is for the president of our country to use either today or his opening statement to Parliament next year to apologize to victims for the injustice that has been done by the democratic state. The second is for him to appoint a special director to head up a special unit, not the nonsense that they have now, that they proudly proclaim, but a specialized unit with a special director dedicated to dealing with the TRC cases and ensuring that you have the prosecutors, the finance, and the resources there. The third, I think, is the setting up of a commission of inquiry, and I know we have commission fatigue, to investigate why the state is implicated in the deliberate suppression of investigations and prosecutions. And the fourth is to really think hard about reparation, which all South Africans who have the means can contribute to, and to deal with the money in the President's Fund.
Jasmin, we will talk again next year. That's our wish list for 2022. Let's see what happens. Thank you. Thank you for talking to us. I got to end it there. Jasmin Sooka is a lawyer, former commissioner at the TRC and former executive director for the Foundation of Human Rights of South Africa and Reconciliation. And that's where we have to leave it.